Okay, so um, have you ever like driven home from work and just like you suddenly realize you don't even remember the last few miles? Like your brain was totally on autopilot.
It's so common, right? It's like our brains are just amazing at making those shortcuts for, things we do all the time.
Exactly. And what if that autopilot mode, kicks in our relationships?
Yeah,
That's what we're looking at today in this deep dive with being on autopilot.
yeah. This is a cool topic. It's really all about how those unconscious patterns and habits that we all have can like impact our relationships, for good or bad.
Yeah, and it's not always these big dramatic things, is it? Sometimes it's the little things that become so automatic. You know what I mean? Like maybe you always say "I love you" before hanging up the phone, even if you're actually feeling like kind of frustrated with your partner at that exact moment.
Oh, yeah, that's a perfect example. It shows how autopilot can sort of mask what's really going on, like you said, those underlying emotions. Or it shows up in how we deal with conflicts, maybe falling into the same old patterns, even if they don't really work.
Totally. It's like we're just playing out the same script, even when it's not getting us anywhere good. Right?
Okay.
Or like we maybe even stop noticing the little things our partner does that we used to appreciate, like making coffee or taking the trash out.
Exactly. It's like we get used to those nice things, and that initial excitement kind of fades. And being on autopilot actually goes into the psychology behind this, like specifically this thing called habituation theory, which says basically our brains get less sensitive to stuff that happens over and over again.
Oh, so even good things can kind of lose their shine,
Mhm.
like because of autopilot. That's a little bit sad, huh?
I know it can be. It's not that we don't care anymore. It's that our brains, they kind of adapt to save energy. It's like that example they give of a daily kiss goodbye. Like it can turn into just a routine instead of a real expression of affection.
Right, right. That makes sense. But it's not just habituation theory here, is it? There are other things affecting our autopilot, right?
Definitely. Being on autopilot also talks about cognitive load theory. It basically means like when we're really stressed or overwhelmed, our brains rely even more on those automatic responses. Like if you think about it, when you're totally maxed out mentally, you're way more likely to snap at your partner. Not because you're mad at them, but just because your brain is fried.
So it's like our partners might end up kind of dealing with the fallout of our busy brains. Something to keep in mind, for sure.
Totally. And it gets even more complex when you bring in like societal norms and stuff. This idea of habitus from the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu is super relevant. Basically, it says our social environment really shapes how we act automatically and even how we see things, sometimes without us even realizing it.
So, like how society often pushes men to be, strong and silent, and women are expected to be more nurturing and emotional, are those kinds of expectations kind of messing with our relationship autopilot?
Exactly. We might fall into those traditional gender roles not because we're choosing to, but because it's what we've always been taught. And that can definitely cause friction in a relationship if those roles don't fit our individual needs.
This is making me think about my own relationship now. Have I like ever really questioned why I do certain things? Could it be like those unspoken societal expectations?
That's a great question to think about. And being on autopilot really encourages that kind of critical self awareness. Because if we can understand what's shaping our behaviors, then we can start making more conscious choices about how we're interacting with our partner.
Okay, so we've seen that autopilot can be both good and bad in relationships, but is it ever truly a good thing? Can those automatic behaviors ever actually be helpful?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Think about the comfort and stability that comes with like those set routines. Maybe you have a standing date night or like a system for splitting up chores. Those kinds of predictable patterns can really create a sense of security and lower stress in the relationship.
I see what you mean. It's like those routines are a good foundation so we can focus on other things in the relationship, right? And I'd imagine those consistent little acts of kindness, even if they become kind of automatic, can still add to that feeling of love and appreciation.
Exactly. But as being on autopilot stresses, it's all about finding that right balance between like healthy routine and that conscious effort. We don't want to get so stuck in those automatic things that we totally miss the individual needs, of ourselves and our partners.
Right, because when that happens, autopilot starts working against us instead of for us.
Exactly. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll look more at those potential problems. Like what are some signs that autopilot has taken over and what happens when those unconscious patterns lead to like disconnection and conflict.
Sounds interesting. It sounds like we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how to recognize when autopilot isn't working for us anymore. I'm guessing you'll have some ideas on how to fix it when that happens.
Absolutely. We'll dig into some strategies for breaking free from that negative autopilot and offer some practical tips for creating a more conscious and connected relationship. So stay tuned.
So, welcome back to our deep dive into being on autopilot. We've been talking about how those automatic behaviors we all have can impact our relationships, right? The good and the bad.
Yeah, it's not about saying autopilot is always good or always bad, you know? It's more about figuring out when it's working for us and when it's time to be more, well, intentional.
Exactly. And last time we kind of left things on a bit of a cliffhanger, didn't we? We hinted that autopilot can sometimes lead to disconnection and even conflict. So let's dig into that a bit more. What are some signs that our autopilot might be kind of going off track, you know?
Well, being on autopilot mentions a few, like, warning signs to watch out for. One that's super common is avoiding those, like, tough conversations. If you find yourself always, sweeping stuff under the rug or changing the subject when things get uncomfortable, that's a big one to pay attention to.
Right, that makes sense. It's like we're trying to keep things, peaceful on the surface, but all that unresolved stuff is just building up underneath. And I bet that can lead to a lot of resentment, huh?
Exactly. And it's not just about avoiding like outright arguments. Autopilot can also make us kind of neglect our partner's emotional needs, you know? We might just assume we know what they're thinking or feeling without actually checking in.
Oh, yeah, I've totally done that before. It's so easy to fall into that trap of thinking, well, they haven't said anything about it, so it must be okay.
Oh, people change and relationships change, right?
Mhm.
What worked before might not work now. And when we're on autopilot, we can totally miss those little shifts in what our partner needs.
That's a good point. And it ties into another thing being on autopilot talks about, taking our partners for granted. When those nice things, those everyday gestures become routine, we might stop like really acknowledging them and appreciating them.
Yeah, exactly. And that can create this distance, emotionally. It's like we're just going through the motions without really seeing and valuing our partner for who they are.
So we've talked about how autopilot can go wrong. But the big question is, how do we actually start breaking free from those bad patterns? It's one thing to recognize the problem, but actually changing those habits that are so ingrained, that feels tough.
You're totally right. It definitely takes effort. But being on autopilot and some of the other stuff you've got, they offer some practical tools, things that can really make a difference.
Okay, lay it on me. Give us the tools to reprogram our autopilot, Rice.
Well, one of the most powerful things is something we talked about before, mindfulness. It's basically about being more present, paying attention to what we're thinking and feeling and doing, right now.
So instead of just reacting automatically,
Yeah.
we're hitting pause and really tuning in to what's going on, both inside him and with our partner.
Exactly. Like hitting the pause button on that autopilot so you can make a choice about how you want to respond. Let's think about that example of avoiding tough conversations. Imagine your partner brings up something that makes you uncomfortable, and your first instinct is just to shut it down.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
So, with mindfulness, you might notice that feeling, that urge to withdraw. But instead of giving in, you just take a breath and acknowledge it. You might say to yourself, okay, I'm feeling anxious right now. What's making me feel this way?
Interesting. So it's not about pretending you don't feel it, but more about just noticing it and trying to understand it.
Right, exactly. And once you've acknowledged that feeling, you can choose a different way to respond. Maybe you say to your partner, hey, this is a tough conversation for me, but I do want to hear you out. Can we maybe take a break and come back to this in a bit?
Oh, that's so much better than just shutting down completely.
Yeah.
It shows your partner you care and that you're willing to work through it, even if it's hard.
Exactly. And that open communication, that's another key to breaking free from those negative autopilot patterns. Being on autopilot talks a lot about being clear about your needs and not making assumptions about your partner.
Right, because assuming your partner knows what you're thinking or feeling, that's just asking for trouble, isn't it? We talked about how those assumptions often come from those deep-seated beliefs we have about relationships, the ones we get from society.
Exactly. So you have to challenge those beliefs, those unhelpful ones, and make space for that honest, open communication.
Okay, mindfulness and communication, got it.
Yeah.
But what about when we've gotten into such a rut that it feels like we can't break out of the routine? Being on autopilot mentions creating new rituals. Can you say more about that?
Absolutely. Sometimes we just need to shake things up a bit, Add some novelty to the relationship. Think about those daily routines that have gotten a bit too automatic. Like maybe you always eat dinner in front of the TV.
Oh, that's us. So easy to fall into that habit.
Right. But instead of just zoning out in front of the screen, what if you like set the table, lit some candles, and actually talk to each other during dinner?
That's such a small change, but I can see how it would make a difference. It's about being more intentional, more present.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's not just about mealtime rituals. Think about other parts of your relationship that have gotten predictable. Maybe you always go to the same restaurant for date night, or you fall into the same patterns when you're making decisions as a couple.
So it's about like breaking out of those routines and trying new things together.
Yeah, exactly. It could be as simple as exploring a new part of town, or taking up a new hobby together, or even just like switching up who usually initiates, intimacy.
I like those ideas. It's about remembering that relationships should be fun and exciting, not just predictable routines.
Exactly. And that sense of playfulness, that can really help break those negative autopilot patterns. But what about those really ingrained habits? The ones that feel like they're just part of us? Are those even possible to change?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. It feels like some of those patterns are so deep, they're just part of who we are.
Well, that's where this idea of neuroplasticity comes in. It basically says our brains are incredibly adaptable. We can learn new things and create new neural pathways throughout our lives, even if we've been stuck in a certain pattern for years.
So even if I've been reacting to conflict with like anger and defensiveness my whole adult life, I can still learn to react with calmness and empathy.
Totally. It takes work and you got to be consistent, but it's definitely possible. Think of it like learning a new language or a musical instrument. It feels weird at first, but with practice, it becomes more natural.
That's so encouraging. It's like our brains are these incredible machines that we can reprogram if we put in the effort, right?
They really are. And that's why understanding neuroplasticity can be so empowering. It reminds us that we're not stuck with our old patterns. We can change and grow.
But let's be real, sometimes we need a little extra help, right?
Yeah.
Is there a role for like professional support in this whole process of breaking free from autopilot?
Oh, absolutely. Therapists and counselors can be amazing allies. They can help us figure out what's really driving those autopilot behaviors and give us tools and support to make real changes.
So it's not a weakness to get professional help. It's
Yeah.
actually a sign of strength,
Yeah.
right? A sign that we're committed to improving our relationship.
Exactly. It's like taking your car to the mechanic when it's making a funny noise. You wouldn't just ignore it and hope it goes away, right?
Okay, so we've talked about mindfulness, communication, creating new rituals, and even therapy. But is there anything else listeners can do, like on their own? Any simple, everyday things that can make a difference?
That's a great question. And yeah, there are definitely some small but powerful things people can try. One of my favorites is something called gratitude spotting.
Gratitude spot. Okay, I like the sound of that. Tell me more.
It's a simple mindfulness practice that can help us like snap out of that autopilot mode and start appreciating the good stuff in our relationship. Basically, you make a conscious effort to notice and acknowledge the things your partner does that you're thankful for.
So like, if my partner makes me coffee in the morning, I actually like take a moment to smell it and say thank you instead of just grabbing it and running out the door.
Exactly. It's about shifting from taking those kind gestures for granted to really appreciating them.
I love that. It's like we're retraining our brains to focus on the positive instead of just zoning out.
Right.
Any other simple practices like that you'd recommend?
Yeah. Another one is practicing active listening. When your partner's talking, really focus on what they're saying. Put your phone down, make eye contact, ask questions to make sure you understand. It shows them that you're really present, not just going through the motions.
That's so important because when we're on autopilot, we're not really listening, are we? We're just waiting for our turn to talk or think about what's for dinner or whatever.
Exactly. Active listening is such a powerful way to break out of that autopilot haze and have a more meaningful connection.
So we've got gratitude spotting, active listening. What else can we add to our autopilot busting toolkit?
How about adding some playfulness and spontaneity to your relationship? When was the last time you surprised your partner with something fun, like maybe a little gift, or a fun date night, or even just a spontaneous dance party in the kitchen?
I love that. It's like we're reminding ourselves that relationships should be fun and exciting, not just a bunch of predictable routines. Right?
Exactly. And that sense of playfulness can go a long way in breaking those negative autopilot patterns. But, there's a question that comes up. Is there a downside to being too intentional in a relationship? Can we overdo it with all this self-awareness and effort
That's a great question, and it's something we'll talk more about in the last part of our deep dive. We'll talk about finding that sweet spot between effort and ease, and we'll leave you with some final thoughts on how to make being on autopilot work for you, not against you. So stay tuned. So welcome back to the deep dive. We've been really digging into this whole idea of being on autopilot in our relationships, and it's been pretty fascinating to see how these everyday habits can have such a big impact.
It really does show you the power of those unconscious patterns, right? Like we've been saying, autopilot can be both good and bad. And we've looked at ways to break free from those negative routines.
Right. But before we wrap things up, I got one more question.
Yeah.
We've talked about finding that balance between autopilot and, being more intentional. But is there such a thing as being too intentional? Could all this self-awareness and effort actually backfire in our relationships?
That's a really good question. And actually, being on autopilot touches on that too. It's kind of like anything else. Too much of a good thing can end up, well, not being so good.
So how do we know if we've gone too far? What are some signs that maybe we're overthinking things and taking the joy out of it?
Well, one thing to watch out for is constant analyzing. If you're always picking apart every interaction, second guessing every decision, overthinking every single text message, that might be a sign you're getting a little too stuck in your head.
Okay, so a little reflection is good, but too much can be paralyzing. Got it. What else should we be aware of?
Another thing is trying to control everything in the relationship. It's kind of like we talked about before with those societal expectations. Sometimes we get so focused on doing everything right that we forget to just, enjoy the moment and let things happen naturally.
Right, it's about finding that sweet spot between being intentional and just being present, between effort and ease. But how do we actually do that? It seems tricky.
It is, and I don't think there's a magic formula, but one thing that helps is the idea of, choosing your battles.
Oh, I like that. So we don't have to analyze every little autopilot behavior. We can be more strategic.
Yeah, exactly. Focus on the patterns that are really causing problems. And even then, when you do decide to address something, try to approach it with curiosity and compassion for yourself and your partner.
Such good advice.
Yeah.
It's not about blaming each other, right? It's about working together to make things better.
Exactly. And I think that's a key takeaway from all this. Autopilot is just part of being in a relationship, but it doesn't have to run the show. We can become more aware of our patterns, make conscious choices, and build the kind of relationship we really want.
This has been so eye-opening. I feel like I have a much better understanding of this whole autopilot thing and, how to make it work for me, not against me.
That's great to hear. And I hope everyone listening feels empowered to, start exploring their own autopilot behaviors and making those positive changes.
So where can people go to learn more? I know being on autopilot is a great place to start, but are there other resources you'd recommend?
Oh, for sure. There are tons of amazing books and articles out there that go deeper into everything we talked about. You might find the work of relationship experts like John Gottman and Sue Johnson helpful, or look into stuff from psychologists who focus on habit formation and mindfulness.
Perfect. We'll be sure to put some of those resources in the show notes so everyone can keep learning. And as we wrap up this deep dive, is there any final thought you want to leave us with?
Just remember, relationships are a journey. There will always be ups and downs, times when you're on autopilot and times when you're really present. The key is to approach it all with curiosity, compassion, and a willingness to learn and grow together.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll say goodbye for today. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep